Okay, and so that motion was denied. That was the one pertaining to the fact that the state wanted to ask these police officers about Kim Potter being their union president. She used to be their union president, and how they may have a bias in her favor because of that. And that motion was denied by the judge. Lisa, do you really think, as a former police officer, that just the fact that someone used to be your union president and you may have worked closely with that person on the job, you know, this is a job where they describe it as a brotherhood, a sisterhood, does that really mean that you're automatically going to have a bias in that person's favor? I mean, this whole thing was caught on video. So, you know, the video pretty much speaks for itself.
Yes, it really does. And there is a code, don't get me wrong. In law enforcement, officers tend to want to protect their fellow officers. And a lot of times they do so even when that officer is wrong. They feel as if they're in a catch-22 if they don't. So yes, that does definitely happen. But all of the evidence they laid forward stating she is no longer a police officer, she doesn't hold that power position. If she were not to be charged with, and if she were to be found innocent on these charges, she's not stepping back into that role where she would have power and influence over the people who are testifying about what happened that day.
All right. And as I mentioned, that motion was denied. The judge is not going to allow the state to elicit this testimony about Kim Potter being the former union president. Earl Grey doesn't hold back. He doesn't beat around the bush. I think Earl Grey is very good. I think he's very effective. And he, you know, he's not loud about it. He's just who he is. He's just a guy. He's up there doing his thing. You know, he does a good job. Lisa, I want to ask you about this too, because you're a former police officer. So basically the state is saying, well, they're not experts. I mean, but they're out on the street every day. And we know that oftentimes these expert witnesses who testify in these cases, they used to be police officers. So do you think it's fair for the state to basically say, you know, they can't do this, they can't testify to those facts?
Yeah, this is a case, I think, where the prosecution's witness became a positive for the defense because they didn't expect that officer to come forward with that information that wasn't there. And as he said, they didn't interview, they didn't prep their client enough in order to help them. So it became open game for him to ask those questions. And it was a spontaneous response when he made that statement about use of force. Police officers are all trained in the use of force continuum. They know when deadly force is supposed to be used. They're trained for that over and over again.
They certainly are, and we often hear them testify. I mean, they're asked about these things when they get up on the stand. And it happened in the Chauvin trial, too. Many of the state's witnesses in the Chauvin trial were just cops on the beat or supervisors, and they were asked their opinions, and it was permitted. So it's interesting that it's become such an issue in this trial. And that was a supervisor of Kim Potter's discussing and demonstrating how they pull their tasers, how they use these things. So I want to start with Lisa Lockwood on this, since she's a former police officer. Lisa, do you see this testimony as helpful or hurtful to Kim Potter?
Well, the fact that you have to cross your body and it's in a completely different position, it's not your dominant side, shows that there's supposed to be a pattern interrupt. So when she was ready to draw her taser, thinking she drew her taser, she actually drew her duty weapon, which was on her dominant side. And that's what the muscle memory comes from in all of the training, because most practice is with your duty weapon. The tasers came in about 20 years ago, and you're supposed to be trained once your company or municipality implements them, and you're supposed to test them regularly right before your shift so that you get more familiarity with that, just like you would with your duty weapon.
Well, Roger, I think maybe you should be sitting second chair to Earl Grey, because it sounds like you just made some good arguments for Kim Potter. Something that was really interesting that you just touched on, I want to ask Lisa about, because this is what I was thinking as they were going through the diagrams, you know, the image of the body, you should be shooting here when possible, when practicable, things of that nature. But these are not practical situations that these officers are put in, Lisa. These are dynamic dynamic situations. You've got a guy who's trying to get away, and whether you were trying to aim for an area other than his chest or not, you know, he's wiggling around. This is a tussle. This is not an ideal situation. So some of this, I think if you're a juror, you might be thinking, well, the guy's wrestling around. Of course, even if she pulled her gun by accident, she might not be able to hit the area that she was trained to hit.
Right, because it is dynamic. You nailed it right on the head when you said that. Every scenario is different, and police departments offer certain scenarios where you get to play, where you have a hyped up energy, where you're in scenarios where you really think that you have an offender, you have role players. I partook in all of that. So I know that getting your adrenaline up, getting your blood pressure up, and putting you in these real world scenarios is part of training. But if it's only done once a year, which it usually is, unless you're on a special team like I was, where we keep going over and over them again and again, a lot of times police officers never have to use their weapon, and people don't realize that, or pull their taser for that matter. And as I said before, in 20 years, we've had 15 times where police officers mistook their gun for their taser, and 2 people were killed, and there were 3 convictions. So a lot of the officers ended up getting off on this particular case because of mistaking it and being in that height of the moment type scenario in which he was in.
And Roger, you may have a really good point there, because Earl Grey is going to have time to rest up overnight and prepare his cross-examination of Sergeant Peterson. But let's go over to Lisa just really briefly and talk about this with you, Lisa. You know, we've talked about how this doesn't happen often, mistaking a gun for a taser. I think you said 15 times it's happened in, you know, the last several years, 20 years or so. So, you know, is that like really the best point to make when we know this is a rare occurrence? We know she screwed up. You know, she would probably tell you, you can tell on the body camera video, she knows she screwed up. She made a mistake. It was awful. But you know, is that the best way for the prosecutor to wrap this up? Because I don't think anybody is saying that this is something that's common.
Exactly. And the defense attorney is going to kill it, so to speak, because bringing all of that forward regarding training, regarding statistics, regarding the other cases where there were only 3 convictions with 15 misfires, mistaken gun for taser, and the fact that, you know, going forward in training, when he posed that question, whether or not an officer had done that during training, I can tell you right now, you don't have your actual duty weapon with you if you are doing taser training. You have a dummy weapon just to make sure that you are completely safe. So I would imagine within that training, it would probably show that, so there weren't any potential misfires or somebody getting caught up in a friendly fire situation.
Well, Lisa, that's a really good point. And even if you are in a training and you are keyed up and you've got that adrenaline going, it's still a training. In the back of your mind, whether you are consciously aware of it or not, it's a training exercise. You know it's a training exercise, and you might be in the zone, but at the same time, it's not the same as being out on the street.
Well, I'm going to say in my training, when I was on SWAT, it was as realistic as possible. So we had paint guns, paint pellets were used in our weapons. We fired those weapons as needed. We made a ton of mistakes along the way. We had victims who were shot instead of the offender. And that's why you have those trainings, because you are hyped up and those mistakes are taken care of during training. And that's why it needs to be so incredibly frequent. So being on a specialized unit like SWAT, that means that you're going to be in more situations like that, which would call for more training. And a regular police officer who's out there on the street, as I said before, when you look at the statistics of them actually using their weapon on duty, the number is so low. You can go an entire career and not shoot somebody, and it happens all the time.
Very interesting. Great insight from you. And that's really interesting that they use the paintballs in your training. That probably makes it even more realistic, just because you're actually seeing a projectile exit the gun.